Can we test it? Yes, we can. I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft vs. Cruft. We've got another refactoring challenge today. This one coming out of a LinkedIn post I made recently, which is just about the general objections you sometimes hear to introducing automated tests. You'll find that most people are in favor of automated testing in principle, but they will say things like, we don't have time to test this right now. Or infamously, this code wasn't designed from the ground up to be testable. So it's very difficult for us to test it right now. And it's not practical. We can't do it. So I will sometimes say that we need to get to a point where we understand that there are professional standards to software engineering. And in a future episode, will get more into what it means for us to say we have a profession and professional standard of care that we adhere to, and what some of those standards might be. And I hope eventually to find, a process that I can participate in by which we kind of collectively get closer to defining what those are. Because there's a lot of, competing ideas, and I think that there's a good common ground that we really could buy in on, and that could be very helpful. One of those, I believe, is automated testing. To give a little spoiler on that conversation. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can do automated testing. There are a lot of different degrees of it in certain situations that might be practical or valuable. But in terms of, do you ship non-trivial amounts of customer-facing production code without some form of automated testing? In my opinion, you don't. So what does that mean, though? I mean, many of us are dealing in a situation where we have these large legacy code bases that don't already have that. And I want to throw you a bone here. I don't want to just say, well, you've got to rewrite everything. So hence putting out this challenge, I contend that it is almost always possible to add at least an initial amount of automated testing coverage cheaply. It is practical to do so, and therefore, the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. And I invite people, and I still do, to submit what they believe are counterexamples to this, so we can look at it. Now, I know a lot of the code that we're working on is not things that we can publicly share, but nonetheless, let's try and find those. Let's see what we would do about those particular situations. And in my previous episodes where I've dealt with obfuscated C code like the donut or the Lisp interpreter, I have demonstrated that with some creativity, you can get these even into very convoluted situations. We're going to look at something a little more normal today. This one was suggested when I posted this challenge as well to the Legacy Code Rocks Slack community. Legacy Code Rocks is a podcast I very much enjoy. You also want to look into Andrew Goulet, who is a big proponent of empathy in tech, which if you've seen my episode, Software Engineering is Social, I'm very much in line with those ideas being something we need to focus on in the industry. But what was suggested in that Slack community by someone named Corinton is that I look at a kata by Sandro Mancuso. And this kata is called the trip service kata. And I find this to be a very characteristic representation of some, code you're going to see, some production code you're going to see that's not immediately testable. And this is therefore a great example of how to inject testability. He also provides a video where he goes over his own solution, and I'd encourage you to watch that. I have not watched that. It will be interesting to see how my approach to this, is the same and different. I think this is a fairly typical example, so I bet there'll be a lot of common ground. But check out his video, check out mine if you like. Let's get into the IDE and see what actually we're looking at. You can find my progress on this, which I'm taking from his Java example, in the Craft vs. Cruft GitHub org in Refactoring Challenge. All these links in the description, of course. So we've got a couple of different classes here. The main one we want to look at is trip service. I keep going back and forth on whether I'm going to use light or dark theme for these, by the way. So I'm using a slightly modified Darkula in IntelliJ here with to get a little more contrast. Let me know which way around you want to see it. Do you want to see a light theme or a dark theme? We're on dark right now. So this has got a trip service class, a little method called getTripsByUser. Let's pour into that, but first let's explore the rest of the domain. We've also got a class called trip, which is, kind of a skeleton right now, but presumably there'd be some attributes on it. And then we have a trip DAO, database access object, right, or data access object. And notice that it just throws an exception right now because the idea is to create a unit test that doesn't actually invoke it. A good reason to do that is that unit tests that hit databases, as you accumulate more and more of them, may become very slow. So in order to get good, fast feedback on the things that don't involve the database, you want to be able to test in isolation. We also have a user, which has got trips on it and friends. Very simple little, we used to call them in Java, we used to call it a bean. You also will call this like a DTO, data transfer object sometimes. And then we have this user session object where we have a session, we can get the logged in user. And again, it's going to throw an exception here, just to force that in solving this exercise, I don't call that, right? So this is something that I must substitute somehow. And then we've got test classes. The DAO doesn't have any useful functionality in it. I don't see much point testing that right now. We know how we could test the user class if we wanted to. It's just got some data on it, some lists. We could write test trivially on that if we choose. We're not gonna do that today. I don't think that's very illustrative. But trip service test, this is where we want to play, right? This is where we've got some code. Let's say we need to make some change to it, and we don't want to know that we don't break the existing functionality. Now you can see Sandro has a blog post on this here and suggests doing the exercise before reading it. All good here. And also, we can't change existing code that's not covered by tests unless we're doing it with an automated refactoring. I'll try to mostly adhere to that here. But if you'd like, click the link, go find the exercise and actually attempt this before looking at either his blog post or my attempt to solve it. I definitely would encourage that. By all means, pause, go try to solve it if you like. So what does this method actually do that we're trying to put under test, right? Well, it takes a user and then it goes and reaches in the user session in this singleton where we've got this get instance here. So already we've got a problem with testability, and it's going to see if the current logged in user is a friend of the user being passed in. If we're not a friend, it's never going to add to this trip list, so it's going to return empty. We're returning empty list if the logged in user is not a friend of this requested user. A little bit of intent being masked by this method name, I feel. We may get to that. And if there is no logged in user, also we're going to throw an exception. But if we are a friend, if we can see the trips, we are going to look up in the trip DAO also some singleton behavior. We're calling a static method on trip DAO to find the trips for that user and then return it. So I can see those difficulties. If I was to start, over here in trip service and try to invoke this and test the behavior, I'm going to run into these two external dependencies, which I have no way of injecting. So what can we do here? I think we're going to run a classic called sometimes peel and slice. And you'll see a lot of this methodology. That my favorite source is Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. But let's just say we need something here. Let's do an extract on this session to get that dependency out of here. Let's see if I can remember the hotkey to drag that up here. So we've now isolated that part, and so we could do an extract method here and have a slightly more testable method where we could inject a user session. However, we're still stuck with this guy, right? We're stuck with trip DAO. So with this static method, what can we do? Let's say that we want to refactor this, convert it to an instance method, right? So now this is an instance method, and if there were external dependencies on this, we'd have to deal with that somehow. Maybe we could introduce, a deprecated static method that delegated to it or something like that. But it's just used internally to this, we'll say. So cool. Now we have also this DAO. It's being newed up here in order to call that. Nice. Still not testable right away, but we can get that out of here. So I could do a couple things here. I could extract it to a field, a class level field, or instance level field. I think that would be a good move here. But for now, let's go ahead and just make it a variable, and also drag up the declaration of it to up here. So now all of the behavior is through interacting with objects that we have declared at the top of the method. What does that mean we could do? We could extract this method, right? So we'll call this get trips by user. Also, it's the same behavior, though again, I think the intent might be a little concealed by this name. And then it takes these two dependencies injected at method level. There are other ways we could inject this, but one step at a time. Let's get it under test, and then we can talk about or organizing the class. So we've got just one extract here, and now we have the external dependencies mocked in a way that we can deal with. So let's go ahead and we got JUnit. It's JUnit 5 though, I think, which it's this Jupyter version, which I'm not that familiar with. I mostly use JUnit 4, but we'll see what I run into. So let's do happy path first. I like doing all the happy paths and then the sad paths. So the exceptional cases, that is to say, come last. So this would be something like find user trips when logged in user is friend. Being very explicit about what happens in what context. Now, I might need to create a trip service. This is the subject of my test. By convention, I'm going to name it subject. And I'm going to get trips by user, and I can't call my the actual API that was pre-existing here, but I can if I raise the visibility, and we'll raise it the minimum amount that we need to. We'll make it a default scope so that from the same package in the test we can access it. There are other things you might do. So I need to pass a user in, but I can also pass some additional things, right? A user session. And can I just make a user session? What can I do here? Okay, that's private constructor. We could just change that, but I think it's supposed to be a singleton on purpose. So let's make this something that we can fake out. And we'll get to that in just a second. And then we want this trip DAO. And again, if we want testability, we would need a fake version of this is one way to approach that. Now, what I would have at one point done here is at this point, I would have started busting out something like Mockito and use automocks in order to do this. I think what I would do now is not go to the automock framework right away, but I might make fake objects explicitly that are a little easier to use, that I can reuse as I'm using more and more tests. Or there's other approaches too. You can have an in-memory database you're subbing out and then be able to use the DAO more directly in tests. But for the purpose of this exercise, right, we want to make sure that this gets called, but not actually call it, then what we would probably do is extract an interface. So I'm going to just sort of mimic what you would do with an AutoMock library as though we didn't have one. I'm going to link a short piece by GeePaw Hill about why he prefers not to use AutoMocks. Now, let's, again, using where we can, the IDE refactors, say extract an interface, and that interface is going to include this find trips by user method. Right? All right. So let's do that refactor, and it wants us to put in an interface name. By convention, I will just prefix I with the name. All right. Adding that. So what has happened over here? Nothing, but we can now use the interface here, and it'll work just the same because trip DAO is an iTrip DAO. And it doesn't really help me over here just yet because I don't have any other kind of trip DAO that I can pass in. So let's make a fake trip DAO. All right, so how would we use this to be able to test? Well, because we need to be able to, say, inject some results. Sounds like we would want to inject the found trips. So that's going to be a list of trip, and we'll just start it out with an empty array list. Now, if we're writing actual production code, we probably wouldn't have this field be public. We would encapsulate the access somehow. But since this is only in the test folder, those kind of normal rules don't really apply. I think we can take these kinds of shortcuts. So we are going to return those found trips. And suppose we also want to tell that the appropriate user is being called, passed in here. Well, we can just save the user that was passed. It's going to start out null, and we're going to assign it there. And now we've got a nice little reusable mock for this. We could also avoid doing this kind of verification of that if we wanted to say, make a map of user to list of trip where we, injected for this or that user, you're going to return this or that list of trips. We can make this a little more intricate if we wanted to reuse it a bunch. That might be advantageous, but this is going to work just fine for now. And we'll go back into our test, and we're going to make a fake trip DAO. And then we have another case of user session. Well, same procedure then, right? If we want to keep this being private with a, singleton and all that, we can nonetheless extract an interface. And probably don't need get instance to be on the interface, but get logged user, which I think get logged in user might be a better name for that, but regardless, we'll put that in there, and it just wants us to give a name for the interface. Let's say iUser session. Nice. All right, we'll add that to version control. And same as we did before, and make a little fake object. and that's going to implement that. We're going to give it the required method, and we need to be able to set from our test, set the logged in user. There, now we can inject a fake user session, right? Now we still got this this compilation error, do we? You know, because this expects a user session, but it can expect the interface just as well. We can depend on the interface, not the concrete implementation here. There we go. We just missed an import. All right. So this is fine. This is not properly set up yet, but we have our session, we have our user, and we actually need another user. We need the logged in user, right? So let's set that here. And this is the case, the fully positive case, when the user is a friend, right? So let's say the user we're passing in, we're going to add friend of the logged user. And we want the trip DAO to return a trip, right? So let's add a trip. Just extract that out there so we can test with it. So we've assembled all the things in the case. So we'll space this out, right? Assemble, act, and then assert. And let's see, it looks like we need to do some importing here. Import static assertions.star. How's that do us? All right, cool. So we want there to be one result, let's say. So this is the result. So the size of that ought to be 1. Let's see if that much is true. All right, great. Now, what else ought to be true? It seems like it ought to not just be any old trip. It ought to be the trip that we expect, right? So we could assert equals. I think even better than that, assert same, that they're the same exact reference. That trip, and this is expected and actual, right? Is the order that we pass these arguments in. That is important because the error feedback, if they fail, will then show something that's less confusing. So we'll get that first one. Is it passing in the right one? Now, there's another way that this could be wrong, right? Which is that this DAO could have been called with the wrong user, right? So we ought to test that that's done correctly as well if we really want to nail this down. So we want to say expected is the logged in user on what? The trip DAO. All right, what have I wrought here? So those actually weren't the same. The logged in user was not what was passed into the DAO. Oh, right. That's not the user we mean to pass in. So indeed, the code was correct. The test was wrong here. We want it to be the user we pass in to get trips, not the logged in user is the one that we're passing into the DAO. Good. So now that we've got that in there, right, if we were to screw up somehow and as we're refactoring, say, and we actually pass in the logged in user, you know, now the test would fail. All right, back green. I think we're well past a good commit point here, so let me just go ahead and do that. I sometimes in the videos I go a little too far ahead before committing because I'm thinking about making the video. I'm not thinking about my commit trail. Refactor and add happy path test. We've got just a positive case covered. So already we've gone from having no test coverage on this to having some. And that didn't take long, did it? That must have taken 10-15 minutes. Like, don't tell me you don't have 10-15 minutes when you're needing to make a change to get from no test coverage to a little, if you know these little techniques. So let's go further. Let's completely test this because I'm sure that was the intent of this kata. There's a couple of sad paths that I might want to cover here. So let's suppose the user is not a friend. Well, then we probably intend to return nothing is what at least the current behavior of this is. So let's go ahead and get that here. Find no user trips when logged in user is not friend, say, right? So we're just going to not add the friend, and we're going to expect that we get no results back, right? Now, sometimes when I'm doing this and I get a green right away, I think, did that really work? So let's say that if we if we broke this on purpose, would we get a red? If this were always true, okay, we get a red. If this were always false, we get the other one red. All right, good. So undoing that, we do have a test that's really exercising this logic. And I'm kind of using the thought process of test-driven development, even though I'm doing test last here, because I'm really making sure, okay, do I have a red, then a green, and then potentially a refactor step. Now, I'm noticing some duplication here, right? As we add more of these tests, we're creating the subject, we're creating the DAO, we're creating this fake session. It's a common thing to do to extract these into a setup step. Perhaps you like to do that, perhaps you don't, but I usually do it. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in, I think it's called before all or before each, depending on what you want. Before each, I think, is the right one here, because I think, each step should be in isolation. So we'll make a little setup method here. And I'm just going to plop this up here. And again, it's common there. And extract some fields. Fumbled that first one a little, you get the point. So now we should be able to run it again. And now we've only got that set up in one point. The individual cases are a little cleaner. Now, could be cleaner still, maybe. So there's another sad path that we noticed earlier, which is that this throws exception when when no logged in user, let's say. Right, so this is going to be, we're going to not set a logged in user. And then how do we do this? Well, we used to do like expected in JUnit 4, but I think they've changed this a little. I had to look this one up recently. So assert throws, and what is the kind of exception that we expect in that case? We expect a user not logged in exception. All right, cool. And then a little closure, a little Java 8 and above closure. That is where the code will run, and we don't need a result anymore because it's going to throw an exception. There won't be a result. Okay. Excellent. What if we didn't have that, right? Let's get our virtual red step. And just like what if we return null there instead? Would that still, and semicolon, get it compiling. Would we fail our test as we expect then? Yes. So probably a good test. Excellent. Let's do another commit point here. Add sad path test for trip service. Excellent. Now we've got this. Now, if you're a real stickler, if you're looking at your test coverage, you might find that this particular method is not under test. The method with all the logic is up to you how much you care about that. We might contend this is not really likely to break, or we might find a way to test it. I'm not very particular on that. If I'm looking at this object, though, how I usually expect objects in my projects to look, I would think, well, trip.dao isn't really something that I would want to new up and pass in here. That's probably something that trip service carries around with it. Maybe it's not session level. Maybe the user session isn't part of that, or maybe it needs like some session factory as a dependency. But definitely the trip.dao is something that ought to be on the object. You might. That might not be the case depending on your situation, but I like to do constructor injection on things like that. So let's say that in our test, actually, let's show the way that's going to look. And we'll say we want to pass that in here, right? This is also where, and we don't want to pass in the fake trip.dao, we want to pass in the interface. So we'll just assign it and then let that work. It's final by default. That's good. Now it's being passed in. If we've got other people that are already using a copy of trip service, we'll have to make sure that they're injecting this in the constructor as they should, or we'll have to provide a default constructor that does that. But we don't need that anymore. We don't need that. We don't need that. Now, you think, oh, I'm changing the interface in the class. I'm not really, because get trips by user was the one that was used externally, mind you, right? This is just the one that was used by the test. But if I would want to account for that. So, all right. Good. We could also incorporate the user session into this as well. We could say that that's constructor injected, or this depends on the life cycle of the object. If the life cycle of this object is bigger than one user session, then we might need this to be like some kind of user session factory or something. There's some different options there, but I'm not too concerned with that aspect of this, right? Like, just inline that. We're talking about one line of code here. I'm not really big worried about that. Now, if we're going to say we've now got pretty good test coverage on this, let me commit. We've changed the object structure, use constructor injection. So let's suppose I were refactoring this normally. What might I do? I notice that we've got a concept within a concept here. We've got like just finding whether or not this user, whether the logged in user is a friend of the user we're asking about. Well, that seems like its own concept, right? Well, what if I drag this down here and I just extract that, right? Is friend user, logged user. Let's just make clear what this second arg really is. It's the one that may be a friend. It's the one that we're testing. Say, okay. And if we wanted, we could, add a separate unit test. We could raise its visibility slightly and we could test this directly. I think that would be a good idea if the ticket we're implementing calls for us, adding more logic around this maybe the definition of friend becomes bidirectional or checks to see, on some blocked list or any of other things. Then we might, rather than adding additional tests at the higher level, maybe we test this directly. Maybe this is something that gets checked in more than one place and belongs, in a separate object. There are different options there. But for now, we've just got, this extracted out to a different method that has its own name. The code's slightly better. Let's see if that passes. True. Good. Then looking at this, every time I see a break statement, I think, is there anything we could do other than that? Well, now that we've got this into a method, we could actually return at that point. If we found this friend, then that means we can return true. That's the miracle of scoping here. And if not, then we return false at the end. Well, that's a little simpler. Little fewer, we're looping constructs. Also the case that this is a very common pattern, just like checking if a particular element, matches in a list. We could also use, contains probably for this, right? Could it really be that simple? Could we use contains on this? Yeah. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that it's more than an object reference that would determine if these things are really a match for one another, because in reality, probably wouldn't be. So, and maybe contains is going to use equals, and maybe it's going to do reference equality. But let's suppose we need to do something else. So we could also do, let's see, is there a match? Yeah, with the stream API. If any match, and then we would do, let's see, the element, another little closure here. And, in this case, it's equals. But we'll say F for friend, right? Maybe. In this case, it's equals, but it might be like an ID comparison. It might be any number of things. That's another way that we could implement this. Either way, it's, gone from being a loop with a break in it to a one-liner. And let's see what else. So we've got this is friend. Well, that's only used once. So that seems like, now this concept can just be very cleanly inlined. And if we have the trip list, if we can do that, then we're going to return that list. So we're assigning it just to return it. Do we really need to do that? I think we just return it directly. And then this trip list only used in one place. We say otherwise we're returning empty list. And again, we're good. We've got type inference on this now, so we don't actually need to specify trip there. And you might feel differently on this. I think this would be better in the other order, like checking the user is not logged in and then throwing way down here. I'd be used to seeing that in the other way. I'm going to go ahead and see if we can invert that if condition and say, yeah, put it like a guard clause here, right? If the logged in user is null, then throw. Otherwise, we can do all this other stuff, right? How's that? So I'm going to go ahead and call this here. We demonstrated very quickly we're able to isolate those outside dependencies, inject them in a testable way, and get an initial level of test coverage very quickly around this code, where that would fit very normally into our development process if we were about to start working on this. But this was a kata. This was intended as an exercise. This wasn't necessarily the most hairy example. So the challenge stands. Let's look at the most untestable code you can find and discuss how we might approach this in a work scenario. If our goal was to really get that initial level of testing on it so we'd have confidence to change it. Always remember what Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching: with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.